This week, the Trump administration rolled out its plan to overhaul America's immigration policies, asking $25 billion for border protection that includes a wall, tighter restrictions on legal immigration, and a path to citizenship for the so-called Dreamers. The proposal divided those on both sides of the issue. Since Donald Trump took office, there has been inflammatory rhetoric toward non-Americans and increased enforcement of immigration laws. It has many in the immigrant and refugee communities on edge. An unprecedented number of people who came to the United States seeking asylum are now fleeing this country. NewsHour Weekend Special Correspondent Simon Ostrovsky brings us this report from both sides of the Canadian border.
You know, if you cross here, you'll be arrested because it's an illegal way to enter Canada.
Over the past year, thousands have fled the United States across this unofficial border crossing in Champlain, New York, leading to the Canadian province of Quebec. So many have fled that some are even calling it the new Underground Railroad. This is the new reality in America. Refugees and asylum seekers leaving the United States.
I'm leaving America because I was told I would be deported to Burundi. We fled Burundi when people wanted to kill us. I hope that in Canada I'll be protected and that I will live in freedom.
You understand if you cross here, it's illegal, you're going to be arrested, right?
The asylum seekers push ahead anyways because, they say, they actually want to be arrested. Most come from unstable countries in Africa and the Middle East, and they know that they can only claim asylum in Canada after being taken into custody. Crispin Bayaguize told us he made the decision to head to Canada after spending almost a year out on the streets of New York City.
I am Burundian. With the unrest in our country, I have managed to make it to America. It's been 11 months, and I've had no help at all. It's difficult to eat and to find a place to sleep. I filed papers with the immigration authorities, and there was no follow-up. I realized that I would die on the street unless I found some other way.
Most get to the area by bus from New York City. Then, local taxis swoop in to drive the asylum seekers to the border, about 25 miles away. It's a routine that repeats itself several times a day. In the Obama administration's last year in office, only about 2,500 people were arrested for illegally crossing the Canadian border. But in 2017, close to 20,000 fled the U.S. to make an asylum claim in Canada.
It's going to be only America first.
The president's vulgar slur. Why are we having people from blank countries coming here?
Donald Trump's tough rhetoric on migrants has been broadcast widely, and asylum seekers have taken note. His presidency has also ushered in an era of strict immigration controls. Rejections of those seeking asylum have been rising steadily since the Obama era, including those who entered the country legally. Since 2012, they've gone up by 17%. What's different under the Trump administration is a dramatic increase in the number of arrests made by Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. Following his inauguration, they rose 42% over the preceding year. And concerns about arrests, say the refugees we met, have contributed to the climate of fear.
Is that good?
Yeah. But not everyone is happy to see them go.
Is that better?
Yeah. Until recently, Janet McFetridge was a typical retiree living in the area. But ever since refugees started appearing shortly after Donald Trump's inauguration, she volunteers her time on the American side of the border to make sure the travelers have clothes to keep warm.
I'm part of a group of people concerned about the refugee population that's been passing through the area. I've just noticed that they are ill-prepared for the brutal winters that we have here in the North Country. I have my car stocked with hats, gloves, mittens, scarves, coats. And when they climb out of the taxis, I assess what they might need.
Roxham Road is no different than dozens of other streets that dead end at the Canadian border in this part of upstate New York. But the asylum seekers have turned this rural street into a busy crossing point.
I don't know how the word spread that that was the place to go, but I think in February they had about 400 people cross, and then in August there were 5,000. If we're going to look at the real causes to it, it would be people afraid to stay in the United States, fear of deportation, fear of harassment.
According to village lore, Janet's home was once part of the network that smuggled escaped slaves into Canada.
This house is locally known as one of the Underground Railroad houses. So there was an active Underground Railroad line going right through this area up to Canada. Of course, we're only a couple of miles from the border, so it makes sense.
So what do you have here?
25 years ago, we tore the floor back. We saw a big cistern. It was huge, probably about 6 feet deep. And we think that that is where the Underground Railroad passengers were probably kept when they were staying here.
And it's right below our feet?
It would be right under there.
So it would have been the perfect hiding space.
It would have been perfect.
In this part of the northeast of the United States, the border with Canada is just a straight line that's largely unprotected. But further west, it's the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes, which is why so many of the refugees and asylum seekers channel to this part of the country to go to Canada. A couple of miles from the crossing used by most of the asylum seekers, it looks like the border is unmanned. But just as we were about to leave, a Canadian patrol came to check up on us. Has 2017 been an out-of-the-ordinary year for your job?
What do you think?
I think the answer is yes.
Yes.
Well, what do you think is causing so many people to go north to Canada?
Oh, no. I won't answer the question like that. I'm not here for that.
No.
We have some people for that.
So you had a good time on
The person who handles the questions is a spokesman for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who we met in Montreal, Quebec.
It's unusual for us having people walking toward us who wants to be arrested, you know, because when we see them coming at the border, we give them a warning, saying, guys, you're committing a crime, we'll have to arrest you. And then when we say that, they start walking toward us, presenting their hands, and they want to be arrested.
But why they are leaving the United States, is that a question you've asked yourself?
I cannot elaborate on that, and we cannot speculate on that.
We asked one of the recent arrivals the same question. John Arango is one of the tens of thousands who fled to Canada last year. After having fled post-election violence in Kenya in 2008, where he said he was targeted as an opposition activist, he spent nearly a decade in the U.S. waiting for his asylum case to be heard, after coming into the country legally on a visitor's visa. Although he had an asylum hearing set for the summer of 2019, 11 months into the Trump administration, he chose to flee.
When the new administration came in, it's like everything just changed. Living in America was terrible because now you don't know. You don't know whether the due process will be there, whether you can be just deported like that. It is like something hanging on your neck. Every day you wake up, you don't know.
Now John spends his days reading in a library in Canada. He has a new asylum case pending here. He said he made the tough decision to flee the U.S. after 3 other asylum seekers he knew were suddenly deported before they got their day in court.
These are fragile people. These are people who have a lot of fears. These are people who are going through hell. Then you take the little hope they have away from them. People see Canada as a country where they can be welcomed and be subjected to due process.
The message is one that Canada stands by, that if you're fleeing terror, persecution, and violence, well, that makes you a refugee. We welcome refugees into this country.
In Canada, asylum seekers are initially housed in shelters like this one at the northern tip of Montreal. But soon after, they're provided with monthly stipends they can use to rent their own apartments.
Okay, so the backpacks should have everything that they need for lunch.
Rachel Shugart, another volunteer, is an English teacher who helps them settle in by donating school supplies and clothes.
Lunchbox? So you can take your lunch to school? Okay, bye, see you later. We've been watching the news. We know that America's been sort of turning inwards. So I can't say we're super surprised to see something like this happening, but it really is shocking when you actually think about the numbers.
But despite the fact that the average asylum seeker gets more assistance in Canada than in the United States, not all of them will end up obtaining residency.
There is a process to determine whether someone is a refugee. There are steps to go through.
Most of those... An ally of the Canadian Prime Minister in Parliament told us just how many claimants of Haitian origin got turned down last fall.
Here in Canada, it's like our Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said, diversity immigration is a strength. But what I can say, I remember in September, only 10% of the Haitian group seeking for asylum was accepted. So it's important for them to know that they could be removed.
Still, these days, many say their chances of getting a fair hearing are better in Canada than back in the United States.
It's always been people streaming into this country, and we've always had waves of immigrants coming into this country. I cannot think of another time in our history of the United States where people are leaving this country in such great numbers.
America is made of immigration. That's what it is. It cannot run away from its history, from its identity. No way. That is something that Americans are supposed to preserve, not destroy.
For now, at least, John Arango isn't going to take any chances and is throwing his lot in with Canada, like so many others who are no longer confident about their prospects in the United States.